Okay, so we're going to get started. You guys all got the exercise 124 handout. And once again, we're moving software packages. Though I suspect, well, let me ask the question. How many of you have opened SketchUp before? Right? It's amazing. When I first started teaching SketchUp, I would get like one person. Right? Now it's become kind of the most common early architecture application for people to use. So I suspect that you all are far more proficient than you will let on in terms of your abilities in SketchUp. So instead of concentrating on a lot of the fundamentals of this is how you model something in SketchUp, or giving you a bunch of busy work to prove that you know how to use SketchUp, we will instead spend a lot of time concentrating on getting good quality results out of SketchUp. And how do you collage on top of SketchUp? How do you take SketchUp and bring it back into Photoshop, or take SketchUp and bring it back into Illustrator? Those kinds of techniques. And so today we're going to start with kind of the very basics. If you've never ever touched SketchUp, I'll show you some of the basics of it. I will also talk a little bit about how SketchUp works and how you might want to set up your various pieces that you're working through groups, etc. We will also next class talk about taking your AutoCAD floor plans and bringing them into SketchUp and using that as a base to then start building your 3D model, which I think is a very useful technique. So we're going that direction. Those of you that took 130 already, you may have already seen the Francis Ching Cube House as part of your 130 work. We're going to use that as something to work with today because it's a relatively simple example that is easy to kind of put the building blocks together and go from there. So I'm going to go ahead and do kind of the first half of lecture. I'll talk a little bit about SketchUp and how SketchUp works and some techniques that might be useful to you moving forward. Then I'll let you work for a while, probably in an hour to an hour and a half, something like that. And then at 8, I'll show you guys kind of how do you take what you've created, however far you got, bring it into SketchUp, do some very basic assembly of those component pieces, and ultimately get a nice quality output. So what I'm going to talk about will end up being split in 2 pieces today. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the SketchUp 2016 that's been installed on these computers. And when I do that, I get the Welcome to SketchUp little dialog box here that gives me some options. A lot of people just immediately say start using SketchUp, and that's fine. But there are a few things that we can choose in the templates. Most of the time, if you just say OK, it'll be the simple template, feet and inches. For whatever reason, I think the architectural design feet and inches is a little bit easier to model with, and it seems a little bit less cartoonish. But if you have a preference for the simple template, that's fine. Or if you have the architectural design, that's fine too. I'm going to go ahead and start using SketchUp. And that will then open up SketchUp. SketchUp 2016 changed a few things from the older versions. The biggest change is over here on the right side, where they've docked a bunch of windows into this default tray on the right side. I think it's very, very useful to have this on the right side because all of your little windows sit there rather than being floating, which I think is a good thing. Your SketchUp may not look exactly the same as mine, which is also one of the challenges with the school computers. The bar across the top is kind of the default tool set. But I like this large tool set that's available on the left-hand side here. If this is not showing on your view, you can go to the View menu, select Toolbars, and from there you can check the box for large tool set. You'll see that there's a bunch of other toolboxes that are available for you to go ahead and turn on, and you can dock them around your scene as well. Though for the most part, if you have the large tool set enabled, that's usually enough to get most of what you need done. So SketchUp also, when you first open it up, always has a little person that's right there at the axes. We don't need her or him to continue, so I'll go ahead and select her just with the black arrow here and press the delete key on the keyboard so that she goes away. So in terms of modeling this particular building, it's based on a grid of 4-foot by 4-foot cubes. So the first thing that I need to do to kind of create this, and I know this is redundant for a lot of you, you're saying why do you even need to go through this, is that we have to make the 4-foot by 4-foot cube. And so what I'll do is I'll use the basic rectangle tool that's available over here on the left side, and I'm going to start to draw 4 feet by 4 feet. Now, you'll see that at one angle, right, it will be in a square proportion. And if I look in the lower right corner of my screen, I'll have something that says dimensions, and it'll tell me what the dimensions are. In this case, it's 4'8" by 4'8", which is not the dimension I want. Instead of trying to carefully adjust this piece with my mouse until I get 4 feet by 4 feet, what I can do is I can press the Tab key on the keyboard, and then I can type in 4 feet, comma, 4 feet, which is a lot like what we've been doing in AutoCAD. And I'll press Enter when that's done, and it will then create a 4 foot by 4 foot square. So once again, I can click to start my rectangle, press Tab, and then 4 apostrophe, comma, 4 apostrophe, Enter, and I get my 4 foot by 4 foot cube. Now notice when I'm looking at these two, because this one's a little bit further away, SketchUp has kind of a very dramatic perspective that's set up by default. So the shapes look very, very different if they're close to the origin. So if I did another one here, that one would look almost square. This one is more rectangular, and this one's much narrower. These are all the same size object. It's just the perspective view that's causing those not to look the same. If I were to orbit and start to look down on them, you can see that they are all square. Right? It's just the perspective that changes that view. So it's just something to be aware of. So once I have the basic square on the ground, I'm going to use something called the Push-Pull tool, which is available right here, to pull up my square into a cube. And again, I want to type in a value rather than trying to specify it with the mouse. And I'll just press Tab and then 4 feet. And then I have an object that is 4 feet. I'm going to go ahead and select and delete these other two objects because I don't need them right now. I will warn you ahead of time that with orbit, I have a tendency in Rhino, we right-click to orbit. So there will be many times where I try to do that when I'm in SketchUp. It's just habit. So once I have this 4 foot by 4 foot cube, I can copy this and paste it. I can go to Edit, Copy, and then Edit, Paste. And I can end up with a copy of my 4 foot by 4 foot cube. I can use the Move tool to make the two join together, and they'll snap together when I get close. And now these two are put together. Now one of the problems with SketchUp is it's very sticky. So when you have a shape and another shape and you attach them together, they suddenly become one kind of whole shape. And so if I went back and I said, you know what, I didn't want these two to be connected anymore, and I said, let me select this part of it, and then let me go ahead and move that part away, right? It stays attached to the other half of the shape, right? Which is one of the challenging parts of SketchUp. So rather than copying and pasting them together when they're just regular objects like this, by the way, I undid the last step. That's how I got them apart. I'm going to select one of these cubes. I'll right-click, and I'll go to Make Group. And when I make it a group, right, and I can select this one, and I can make this one a group as well. When I make it a group, and I go to select it, I don't have to select all the pieces. I can just select by clicking on it. And then I could move these two together, and I could say, oh, I didn't really want them together, and I can move them apart. So they stay as separate objects, which is a big advantage. So now that I have those as separate objects, I'm going to start to assemble my 8 cube by 8 cube grid. So I have two. If I press the Control key and let go, I'll get an icon with a little plus next to it. That will copy the currently selected object while I'm moving. So again, Move tool selected, press the Control key, I get a little plus sign next to my cursor, and I can copy. So one of the things that you want to make sure that you do is whenever you pick up an object, pick it up from one of the corners, because then that corner can snap to another corner. So we'll copy from there to there. We'll copy from here to there. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. One more. To 8. What was the question? I just press the Control key while I'm moving. So I have all of these selected. I go to the Move tool. I press the Control key. And I can now copy another set in this direction. Oops. That. Oops. Select those again here. Just holding down Shift. Control key. There. All right, so I now have 7. One more, sorry. An 8 by 8 set of cubes that I can work with. And if we look at the front, I actually have several that I don't need. So I don't need this one, and I don't need these. So I can go ahead and select them, press the delete key. Because they're groups, I can just select any one of these. I can move it, delete it. They're not attached to each other. But if I want to modify one of these, let's say to make this one have the angled front that it has, right? What I'll do is I'll select the object, I'll right-click on it, and I'll select Explode from the context menu. And when I do that, it separates the group into its individual objects. Once I have the individual objects here, I can use my line tool, which looks like a pencil, to divide these upper surfaces with a line. And one of the ways that SketchUp works is whenever you draw a line through a surface, it will split the surface into 2 pieces. If I were to delete that line, it would let my surface go back to just one surface. So there isn't really a trim function in the world of SketchUp. You just divide something by another line, and then you can delete it. So anytime there's an intersection. So I'll go ahead and draw that line back. And then I can select this half of the surface and press the delete key. And so now I have part of this, but I don't have the lower part. So again, I have to use the line tool. And I will draw from here to there. And it fills in because I now have a completely contained object with a surface. And it also divides the lower surface into 2 halves. And I can go through and I can delete more of these objects as well, like that. Now I want to do the same thing over here. So we can delete this and this. I can delete these. I can't delete this yet because I haven't divided this surface. So let me go ahead and divide the surface from there to there. And then I'll delete this and those 2 pieces as well. So I was able to take these groups, break them apart, and build out that little piece of the puzzle here. Now, if I came over here and I wanted to do the ramp, it was 3 objects, right? If I went straight to drawing the line from here to here, right, it wouldn't do anything because I haven't exploded these groups yet. So again, I have to right-click and say Explode, right-click and say Explode, right-click and say Explode. And now I've broken this front face into separate surfaces. So I could, for example, get rid of this, this, and this. I could get rid of the tops. Right? But I haven't divided up these lines yet, and I don't have a line going down the back. So let me go ahead and draw a line that goes down the back. Which gives me this surface, which is fine. If I were to delete this surface, there is no line across, so there's no remainder of that surface anymore. I could, however, add that back in by adding a line across and adding a line across. And I could delete this one and this one. And ultimately, I'll need to delete these as well. So let's get rid of some of these lines. Like so. Okay? So now I have the ramp generated. Do you guys see how I've got some kind of bluish color and then I've got a weird transition of color here? That means that I have 2 surfaces that are on top of each other that haven't become one surface yet. So I actually still need to delete a few surfaces. So if I delete that, this, and this, I get back to a nice clean set of surfaces. Okay? The other option is if I ungroup this object, for example. So let me explode it. It turns white because when you have 2 coplanar objects in SketchUp, as long as they are not grouped, they'll join together and become one object. It's the way SketchUp works. So certainly an option. So at this point, I think you have the skills necessary to build out this building as a whole, because it's just an assembly of pieces. You can create several more blocks. So I have a 1 foot by 1 foot little cube. I have a 2 foot by 2 foot cube. that. And obviously I would use the push-pull to create each of these. So this would go up 1 foot. This would go up 2 feet. That. And then I would select each of them, right-click, and say Make Group. Right-click, Make Group. And then I could work with these to start to build up the assemblies of pieces. So it's really a matter of working with the blocks to stack them up, and the opposite of that would be dividing up the blocks and trimming away. Okay? So I'm going to let you guys go to work working on this. We will restart again in about an hour and 15 minutes around 8 o'clock, and I'll show you the post-processing techniques for how do you kind of deal with getting something out of SketchUp. So I'll turn you loose to model for a while, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about the post-processing. Question for everybody or for you? Okay.
Do these lines have to be there?
What do you mean?
The division lines?
No, they don't have to be, but I think it'll be easier to make if you build it up with the blocks. But if you don't, or you draw them later, that's okay. Really, this is about practicing with SketchUp, and then we'll get to the exporting process. Okay, so I'm going to go over the post-processing part of SketchUp. And wherever you are right now, however much you've built, some of you might have built a little bit more than others, which is certainly on the entertaining side. It doesn't matter. I want you to stop building, and if it's unfinished, don't worry about finishing. You'll still get some decent shadows out when you go to export. But I want to talk you through this kind of this post-processing system. This is all written out. If you go to the Digital Tools site, and then under Tutorials, if you go to Photoshop 4.4, I think. Let's see here. 4.4 styles for Photoshop. It'll walk you through everything that I'm going to be doing in a step-by-step, so you can follow along with that as well. Okay, so what I'm going to start with is I need to establish a general view of something that I want to see. And it could be essentially anything at this point. I could be looking down on my object. I could be looking at it from any particular side that I wanted. We'll talk a little bit more further along in the class about picking the ideal view and really what makes an ideal view. But once I have my view set up, so let's say that this is the view that I like. Once I have that set up, I want to save it as a scene. And saving the view as a scene allows us to go back to the exact same camera angle and general look of our drawing, so that if we decide that we didn't like the renderings that we created or the views that we created or the exports that we created and we wanted something different, we can go back to that exact same view and redo it and drop it right into Photoshop again. So it's important to save that scene. So over here in the default tray, I'm going to expand scenes. I already have several scenes that have been created in this file because I've done this several times. But all I need to do is click the little plus sign next to the scene here, and it creates scene 5. For you, it might create scene 1. And this allows us to come back to this particular scene. I can come down to the bottom here, and I could rename it, and we could call it like perspective, I don't know, 5, because I have nothing else to call it. But I could name it something specific, and then I know it's perspective 5. And the advantage here is that if I went back to orbit and I moved around and I said, oh, you know, I really wanted to add something up here, or I wanted to change something, if I come back and I double-click on perspective 5 here, it'll take me right back to that same view, and I could do a different export or what have you. Okay, so it's important to save the scene first. After I've saved the scene, I'm going to open up the Styles panel. Again, I'm under the default tray, and I've expanded Styles. And I'm going to change from this default style that I'm using to something called Hidden Lines. And it's available under the, hold on a second, I think it's under, no. Sometimes your brain just stops, right? Default Styles, thank you. It's under Default Styles. Brain just like shut down on me. And it's the last one in the top row. It's called Hidden Line. And I'll do Hidden Line because it's a very, very simple line drawing. It's a good place to start when you're doing this kind of a save. So I'm going to turn that on, but I'm going to turn off the axes, the red, the green, and the blue axes, so I have just my building here to work with. So it's just a basic line drawing of my building, and then I'll go to File, and then Export 2D Graphic. Question?
How do you turn off
The axes? Go to View, and then Axes. You want to uncheck where it says Axes. All right, so I'll go to File, Export 2D Graphic, and I'm going to make sure that my Save As type is set to JPEG, and we'll save it on my flash drive here. Nope, wrong place. All right, and I'm going to add underscore lines to the file name so that I know that this is the line drawing. Then I'm going to click on the little options button that's available here, and this brings up the ability for me to choose the image size. If I have use viewport size checked, I'll be limited to whatever the viewport size is. But if I uncheck it, I can type in any value of width up to 9,999. That's the maximum that SketchUp will export. If I were doing this particular project and I wanted to print it on a certain size sheet, let's say I wanted to print it 10 inches across, I would multiply 10 by 300 pixels per inch, or dots per inch, to get 3,000. So if I wanted the ultimate image to be 10 inches, I would have a width of 3,000. If I wanted to be an overall width of, say, 30 inches, right, I would multiply 30 times the 300, and I get 9,000 pixels wide. You guys get the idea for how that works? Maybe? I'm not getting a lot of nods. I'm just getting silence, right? 300. The printing resolution is 300 pixels per inch. So if we take that 300 value, that's for plotters and general printers, if we take that 300 value and multiply it, right, by the number of inches you want your final image to be, you get the overall. So a 30-inch image, final, here, you need 9,000 pixels in width to be able to make it clear. Okay? So for right now, it doesn't matter. We're not doing anything that large. I'm going to type in a value of 2,000. And my JPEG compression at better quality is just fine. I'll say OK. And then I'll go ahead and click the Export button. Okay? And it will then save this particular view as a JPEG. Now I'm going to go in and I'm going to edit a few things. The first thing that I'll do is I'm again still in the hidden line mode, but I'm going to choose the tab called Edit rather than Select in the Styles window here. And when I get to the Edit tab, there's a bunch of little icons. I have this first icon here, which is Edge Settings. The next one over is Face Settings. I want to click on Face Settings. It kind of looks like a tan cube. And then I'm going to click on the box called Xray. And that's going to give me, rather than just white faces, it's going to give me a little bit of as if this were a see-through building. And so for the scope of the cube house, it's not going to really show much. For an architectural rendering, this can be a really good view to have a little bit of ghosting of what's happening inside the building from a design standpoint. Can end up being really nice. So I'll go ahead and go again to File, Export 2D Graphic. And I'll append underscore Xray to the file name. If I click on Options, you'll see that the options are exactly the same as the last time, so I don't have to change anything. I'll go ahead and say OK, and then I'll export. So once that export is done, I'll go ahead and turn off Xray. And I'm going to jump over back to where I have my edge settings. And I'm going to, well, for right now, I'll leave that on just so you can see it. But I'm going to come back and uncheck edges in just a second. I want to show the shadows of this particular scene. So I'm going to go to View, and I'm going to check the box for shadows. And when that happens, we can see shadows on my building. If I don't like what the shadows look like, I can adjust the time of day or year by opening the Shadows window over here in the default tray. And this is where I can adjust the time of day. I could say today, for example, so 4/25. That's today's date at a specific time. Obviously, it wouldn't make sense to do it now at 8:25 p.m. because it would be dark. But I can adjust using this little Slido. Sorry, my tongue is tied. It's been a long day. When I use this little slider, I can choose what time of day I want for my shadows. And so it's really up to you what feels right. I did an afternoon time earlier today, so I'm going to do the opposite. I'll do a morning view on this, something like that as a start. Now let's make those shadows a little bit deeper here so you can see it. Yeah, maybe like that. We'll do that. Okay, so I have the shadows. Now, when I do the export, I want to make sure I come back here to the edge settings and turn off edges. And by turning off edges, all that's left is just the shadows. And I don't want extra lines. I want just a view of the shadows. So once I have this view showing, I'll go to File, Export 2D Graphic. And this time I will call this Shadows. So underscore shadows. Under, right, we're still in, under Select, we're still in Hidden Line mode. Then we go back to Edit, and I'm going to uncheck Edges right here. And when I did that, I lost my guides came back on, so I need to make, or excuse me, my axes came back on, so I need to make them go away. The edges here. All right, and so I've saved the shadows. So now I'll go ahead and turn back on the edges. And I'm going to go back to my Select menu. And the last couple that I'm going to do, I'm going to use some of the sketchy edge styles to do a few more exports to make the final drawing a little bit more casual. Really, which one is a matter of personal preference. I've had luck with a couple different ones before. One is the pen gray, which you have to kind of scroll down and look for. It looks like this. I want to make sure that my shadows are turned off, so we have just the line drawing again. And it's kind of a little bit more sketchy look to it. And I'll go ahead and do the same thing, File, Export 2D Graphic. And we'll call this Pen Gray. Export. And then I need to come down here and look for something else. Now again, you could play around with which ones looked right to you. Something like this might be a little heavy-handed, but you can keep playing around. Sometimes how they export makes them look better or worse. This airbrush with endpoints I've found at large scale exports looks pretty good. At the version that we're going to export today, it's not quite right, but I'll do it anyway. So I'll go to File, Export, 2D Graphic, and we'll call this airbrush. And then I'll go ahead and export again. Okay, so I have those 5 files that I created, starting with the basic line and moving my way through these other styles or various options. And what I'll do now is I'm going to go ahead and open up Photoshop. And I know Photoshop was a long time ago, but we're going to bring it back now. So I'm going to open Adobe Design Standard here and Adobe Photoshop. And once I have it open, I'll go to File and then Open. And I'm going to open the basic, here we are, my basic lines. And so I might have to look through. There's the basic lines. And I'll go ahead and say Open. And there's that first view that I did an export of. Okay? At this point, I'm going to go ahead and do File, Place. So I'm not going to open anymore. I'm just going to place the other files in with this file. So I'll go to File, Place, and we'll open up the next one, which was the Xray. And I'll check the box for yes, and it's now dropped in. I'll go to File and then Place, and I'm just going to do this for all the files. We're going to bring in the shadows. There they are, Place. I'll go to File, Place, and I'll bring in the pen gray. I'll go to File and then Place, and I'll bring in the airbrush. And OK. So if we look over here at my layer stack, I have all of the options. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off everything except for the shadows for right now. But what I'm seeing isn't the whole building. So remember back to talking in Photoshop, we did something with something called blending modes, right? Where we were able to take a white background and make it go away. We're going to do the same thing right here. So I have my file with my shadows in it. I'm going to select that layer. And I'm going to change my blending mode right here to be multiply, which is going to make the white go away and make the shadows come out. Now you're going to ask me, or you should ask me, wait a minute, isn't this the exact same thing as what was in Photoshop or in SketchUp where I had my shadows on? You're right. It's very similar. However, now I can start to modify it in ways that SketchUp can't. Okay, so I have this on. Let me do it for the rest of the layers. Let's take Xray, and let's change Xray to multiply. Let's take my pen gray, and let's change that to multiply. And let's take this last one, which is the airbrush, and let's turn it to multiply. So at this point, this is definitely a little bit too dark. My lines are too dark, so I'm going to have to make some adjustments to make this really stand out. So let's start with just the shadows for just a second. What I can do is I can use the dodging and burning tools that we used way back in the beginning of class to change the shadows. The way SketchUp does shadows, we're limited to just a simple gray to represent shadows. Well, in reality, shadows tend to be darker in the little creases in the corners and get lighter as they come out. So I'm going to do some dodging and burning on the shadows layer. Okay, so I'll make sure that that's selected. I'm going to create a brand new layer. And this, by the way, is throwing way back to Photoshop 1.5. There's dodge and burn. We did that a million years ago, if you remember back. If you forget how to do it, just go back to Photoshop 1.5, and it'll walk you through this process. And you'll see that at this point in the semester, we're going to start folding back on a lot of the things that we've already learned. And I'll refer back to these in case you get a little bit lost. So I'm going to go up to Layer, go to New, and then Layer. We'll call this layer Dodge and Burn. And then down here under Mode, I'm going to change this to be Overlay. And I'm going to check this box down here that says Fill with an Overlay Neutral Color of 50% Gray. So once I've done those options, so again, Mode is Overlay, check the box for Neutral 50% Gray. I'll go ahead and say OK. It shows up right there. And I'm going to perform my dodging and burning on this dodge and burn layer. Okay, so let's take a look. Let me turn off the background here for a second. We have just the shadows. And I want to do some darkening of the shadows kind of in this area. So let me zoom in a little bit. I'm going to switch my tool to my burn tool. And I'm going to work to darken up this edge of the shadow a bit. And we'll darken that edge of the shadow a little bit. All right, something like that. I'll come in here maybe. And we'll darken up that edge just a little bit. All right, maybe we'll darken those just a whisker. All right, and if you're getting a little lost as to what's going on, sometimes it helps to see your building again. Make this a little bit bigger, darken that up. If we want to make it a little bit more diffuse, I can make my brush a little bit bigger. We can kind of fade that out a little bit. We'll fade that out a little bit too. And I've changed, and let me press Control-0 so we can see everything. What before, right, was all a flat shadow, right, just a flat gray color, I've now kind of pushed the values of those forward a little bit. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. I can do the opposite with the edges of the shadows. So let me switch from the burning tool to the dodging tool. And I could come in here, and again, on my dodge and burn layer, I could lighten up some of the edges of the shadows. Right? So they're not quite so stark. Something like that a little bit more, maybe. Right? I could lighten up some of these shadows in here a bit. Maybe in there, it's a little bit lighter. So I've transformed what these shadows look like. Just a bit along the edges there. Maybe a little bit more right there, and a little bit more right there. Right, so I've manipulated the shadows. I've added a little bit more depth to them. So this is kind of very easy stage post-processing. We'll take this a lot further as we go forward, but this is certainly a start. So what I'm looking for today is that you've brought all of these together in Photoshop, that you've been able to do a little bit of dodging and burning on the shadows. If it doesn't look exactly like you want, it does take practice. That's OK. Right? But then with the rest of these, let's turn on Xray, for example. That's probably a little bit strong. I'm seeing a little bit too much of the insides of my cubes. I'll take the Xray layer, and I'll adjust the opacity here down to maybe, I don't know, something like that, 50%. So we have just a hint of what's going on behind. Okay, not too much, just a little bit. Now, unfortunately, my dodge and burn is applying to all of the layers below it. So I want to change and have it just apply to the shadows. I can do that by selecting the dodge and burn layer and pressing Control-Alt-G. And that will tie the dodge and burn layer just to the layer directly below it. I get that little arrow that ties the two together. Right? So those are tied. Now let's look at the pen gray, which when I overlay it darkens up my lines a little bit, and it adds just a little bit of overlap as part of the drawing, which I think can be a nice artistic or casual touch to what you're trying to do. So a little bit of that I think can go a long way. Again, if it's too strong, you just adjust the opacity down to whatever value seems just about right for what you're showing. Now in this case, I told you before that I've used the airbrush before as kind of a way of casualing up the drawing. In this particular case, I think the airbrush is too strong. It adds a little bit too black of lines, and I don't want that. So I'll go ahead and I'll uncheck the airbrush, and I'm going to leave it just with this. So you always have the responsibility of editing your particular assembly of pieces out of SketchUp so that it looks good to you. Right? So make sure that you don't necessarily do everything that I do. I'm trying to show you all the options that are out there. Okay? So once I've finished this, I'm going to go to File, Save for Web, and I'll save a JPEG of this. This is what I'll post on the course website for today as your exercise 124. Okay? If you've embellished it more and you have materials, feel free to play around with those as well. We will ultimately be covering how to collage in materials rather than use the default materials that are in SketchUp. Part of the reason that we go away from the default materials that are in SketchUp is because they never look that realistic. And we can take it a lot further by using Photoshop. And I'm going to teach you guys how to do that in the coming weeks. All right? Are there any questions about this basic post-processing? Again, no matter how far you got in your SketchUp model, even if you didn't finish the whole thing, stop working on that, move over into doing the post-processing, and get a post out for today. It's not something that you have to finish. However far you got is just fine with me. If you embellished it and you added other elements, that's perfectly fine as well. All right?